Hey, welcome world history students. We are in our last week of Unit 1 on the ancient Near East, and it's time to talk about Israel. So we got two lectures this week. This one is on covenant and the law, and there'll be another one on worship. But let's go ahead and get started. And again, one thing you should note on the slides this week, it's not just generic notes that you'll be taking. There's specific questions that this lecture will help you to answer. So make sure you get those specifically from this lecture. All right, let's get started. All right, so first of all, what is a covenant? A covenant is a promise. It's a commitment. It's a commitment with the purpose of bringing about a relationship. In other words, we're going to make a promise to each other between two parties, and we're making these promises so that we can have a relationship with each other. We see this with man and God. God makes a covenant with Abraham. He makes a covenant with Noah. He makes a covenant with people so that he and them can have a relationship. Marriage is just another word for covenant. That when you get married, you both make promises to each other. You commit to one another so that you can have a special, unique relationship, unlike any of your other relationships. A key aspect of a covenant, it's kind of like a contract, like you and somebody's going to do some work at your house, and so you sign a contract, or an employer and an employee are going to work together, and you're going to work for somebody, so you sign a contract. And again, that brings out a type of business relationship. So it's like that. However, the way a contract works is that if you make a contract and the other party breaks their side of the contract, then you're free of your obligation. It sets you free, it breaks the contract, and you can each end that relationship and go your own separate way. Covenant goes a little bit deeper in that it's meant to be unbreakable. And that it's meant to be that this promise, that we're going to make this promise and we're going to enter into a commitment, but that I'm not saying I'm only going to do this so long as you keep up your side. I'm saying I'm going to fulfill this no matter what. I'm in this basically forever. I'm going to be faithful to this covenant. And so that's why in the Bible, where you see a covenant, or if you think about the biblical version of marriage, there really is no expectation that God's going to give up on his side of the covenant, even if human beings fail on their side, or even if one spouse, creates issues with the marriage, the other one in a true covenant principle would say, well, I'm still committed to you. I'm going to fight for this relationship. I have the word salt there because in the ancient world, there was something called a salt covenant. And the idea was that if we were going to have a contract or a commitment with each other, we would each take salt, which was a really precious and even valuable resource, sometimes used as a form of currency. And we will basically take a pinch of salt from each one of our salt bags and we'll deposit that in the other person's salt bag with the idea that saying, I am with you, we are in a relationship, I am committed, unless or until you somehow give me back all of my salt. That you would have to somehow pull out every single grain of salt that belongs to me. And if we could ever re-separate the salt perfectly, then okay, our covenant will be broken. With the idea that, that's impossible. There's no way you could ever create such a you could never undo that agreement. And so that's the strength and the eternal nature of the biblical picture of a covenant. Just examples, we see covenants, promises being made throughout the Bible. The first is Adam and Eve, when God basically puts them in the garden and says, here's what you get to do. You get to rule, you get to reign, you get to live forever. Just don't do this one thing. As long as you don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then we will be able to maintain this relationship. That's the condition. We can have a good relationship if you don't do that. So those were the terms of a covenant. Obviously, that gets broken by the human being's part, and God has to say, okay, now I better find a way to keep my side of the bargain. And how can I get these human beings to be able to live forever? How can I redeem them? How can I bring them back into relationship with me? In fact, the whole Bible is, in the gospel message, is God's attempt to keep his side of that very first covenant. But you get it again with Noah and the flood and the rainbow afterwards, where God makes a promise saying, hey, we can have this society, but you know what? Here's some of the requirements. Abraham, when he pulled him out as just a Sumerian from Ur, he said, hey, you want to be something special? You want to be different than everybody else, all the other cultures around you? Then here's a promise. Here's you're going to be different. You're going to be circumcised. You're going to be a father of many nations. That was a form of covenant. The Ten Commandments and the law, which we'll be talking about more in this lecture, that was a form of covenant, not just between God and Abraham, or even just God and Moses, but between God and the entire Jews who had or Hebrews who had just exited out of Egypt. And he's saying, I'm going to make you into a special nation. You're going to have a unique relationship with me through this covenant that nobody else in the world has. And then ultimately, Jesus establishes the ultimate covenant at the Last Supper when he says, "This is my blood, this is my body. Eat and drink, and you can be saved by me." And so that covenant of saying we can have a special relationship as Christians if we accept these terms of the sacrifice that Jesus has given for us. And so all of these, again, are commitments with conditions that, if met, produce a special, unique relationship that is meant to endure, regardless of whether one side walks away or not. The Mosaic covenant, we call it, that is what's given there at Mount Sinai, where God gives to Moses the Ten Commandments, and then, of course, the entire set of Levitical laws. These laws are moral, they're legal, they're ceremonial, but they're all the idea of God basically saying, hey, you guys who just were brought out of Egypt, hey, you guys who are descendants of Abraham, who I made a promise, who was a descendant of Noah, who I made a promise to, who was a descendant of Adam, who I made a promise to. I have that same promise to you. And so he said, I'm going to set you apart. The Egyptians are doing their thing. The Sumerians are doing their thing. You got Babylonians, and you got Canaanites, and you got Jebusites, and all these other things. They're living a certain way. They see the world a certain way. I want to make you different. I want to set you apart as a holy nation. And it was this covenant that initiated that, and that happened there on Mount Sinai. And so again, Mount Sinai being the transition point, there's where we believe it is, an actual photograph, but where the Jews leaving Egypt and then crossing into the Sinai Peninsula, and then after, of course, the 40 years of wandering would then emerge as a new nation and begin to conquer the Promised Land and walking in their special relationship with Yahweh, with their God. You just see God's intense devotion to his covenant in various scriptures. Jeremiah 30:22, you will be my people and I will be your God. That's what a covenant does. It basically says, I'm giving myself to you, you're giving yourself to me. Now we have a unique relationship because of this covenant. Countless passages, but Judges 2:1, God saying, I will never break my covenant with you. He says a lot of times, if they stray, the things will go bad. There'll be judgment, there'll be punishment. But God's very clear about that unbreakable aspect. It's not a contract, but of a covenant, like a salt covenant, saying, no matter what, I'm going to be there for you. I will forgive you. I will redeem you. I will restore you. And what we see, the picture that we get of the Hebrew God through this covenant promise is, one, he's sovereign. He is all powerful. He rules alone. That's what sovereign means. And because he is able to keep the covenant. He is so powerful that even though man eats from the tree, even though man commits wickedness, even though Israel walks away from the covenant and breaks the Ten Commandments and the Levitical laws, he is still strong enough to find a way to save them. Ultimately, that's what he's going to do through Jesus. We see it's personal, because what does the Hebrew God want from his people? He wants relationship. He wants to be intimate. He wants to, again, I want to be your God. I want you to be my people. This is not a matter of ruling over somebody. This is a matter of saying, hey, much more like a marriage. Let's build a life together. He's faithful. He's going to stick with it, even when basically Israel becomes an adulterous partner. And he's loving, that he says he's seeking good. He's saying this covenant, you becoming different than the other nations, you following under the terms of this covenant, you're going to be better off. You're going to be happier. You're going to be more prosperous. You're going to be the head, not the tail. And all of that you're going to benefit from this covenant. It's a mutual blessing for both of us. And ultimately, the Bible then a lot of times just becomes a continual story of God trying to keep his covenant and mankind breaking the covenant. The Judges, it's just a story of God trying to basically be the ruler of, the king of his people. There was no king set up for Israel. He thought, no, I don't want you to have a king. I want to be your king. I want to be the one you turn to for protection. I want you to be the one you turn to for guidance. However, they don't want to do that. They constantly stray, and God has to send these judges to try to restore them and bring them back into relationship. When that fails, then Israel begins to demand that they'll have a king. And we're going to talk a lot about that this week, saying, no, we don't want to have a covenant with you, God. We want a king we can see. We want a king we can talk to. We want a king who can fight our battles for us. We don't want to worry about this supernaturally. And so again, kind of the story of Israel, and really the story of mankind, is us constantly straying from God's covenant, a covenant that would bring us freedom, but instead we fall into oppression. Again, where a covenant that requires us to have faith and trust our God, but we a lot of times would rather seek our own comfort in the world that we can see. and a covenant that's based on relationship, knowing God intimately, where again, mankind, we tend to fall into religion. Just tell me the rules, just tell me the ceremonies or the rituals I need to do. I don't have enough time or desire to really get to know God. Just tell me, when do I have to be at church and what do I have to wear? Or what's my catechism? How many Hail Marys do I have to say? What sacrifice do I need to make? And so that's a really good contrast of how men tends to think and what the covenant tries to establish: freedom for oppression, faith for comfort, relationship for religion. And so let's look specifically in the second part about the actual covenant. We say the word covenant is relationship, but it actually there is a document. There is a writing out of this promise between God and the Jews, or we could also call them Hebrews. And that's the first 5 books of the Bible, of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These are basically the terms and the history of this first massive covenant. They were known as the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. And again, there's moral directions, there's legal directions, there's ceremonial directions. It's a lot to keep track of at times. But basically, all of these things, all the directions, all the history, all the information about where they came from and how they were created had one intention, and it was to show them, how can you as human beings become right with God? How can we enter into a relationship where you don't offend me, I don't have to destroy you, where we can know each other and honor each other? And so they're directions. The Pentateuch is directions on how man can be right with God. Then we have the Pentateuch really establishes this concept that is absent from places like Sumeria and Egypt, and that is what we call ethical monotheism. So obviously the monotheism applies to the idea that there's just one God. There's one God, not polytheism, but it's ethical in that what this one God wants is he wants righteous behavior from his people. He wants to, again, not just to rule over them and dominate them and have them serve him, but he wants to be in a relationship with his people so that they can do good, so they can be transformed, so they can succeed. That's why he gives them the 10 Commandments. He says, hey, you want to do well, here's the rules that you need to follow morally for your benefit. And one interesting point to make is that the Jews, they didn't think they were getting to join with God because they were better than any other nation. They just thought, we've been selected by this heavy burden to learn to live God's way. But when God says, I'm holding you accountable, when God says, if you don't follow the covenant, I'm going to judge you. Again, it can seem kind of harsh, kind of like, hey, you know what, God, just leave us alone. Let us be like the Egyptians. Let us be like the Sumerians. But again, God looking at his people says, no, 1, that's not good for you. And 2, I value you too much. I love you too much to let you go your own way and destroy your culture and destroy your lives. And I believe that you have the power, you have the strength, you have the dignity and the value to live the right way. If you hold somebody to a high standard, that actually is a compliment to that person, because you're saying, you know what, you can rise to this standard. You might be down here and I'm saying to get here, but I'm not saying that to just make you feel terrible. I'm saying that because you know what, you are more than you think you are, and you are more valuable and more important than you think you are. And so that's what God is saying to the Hebrews through this covenant, saying you, and eventually through you to all of mankind, you have value, you have dignity, and you can do better. And we're going to look at some specific things, what we mean that he was trying to save the Hebrews from. And again, not only was this that we want to have a right relationship with God, but you can just think of the 2 greatest commandments, which is love God, and the second one is love your neighbor as yourself, as you love God. And so the idea is that if you're right with God, you're also going to be right with other people. You're going to be right with your society. And so if I can get in alignment with God this way, then I'm going to be in alignment with the other people this way. And so part of the covenant was not only how do people treat God, but how then are they going to treat each other? And that's why the 10 Commandments, even, you can see they're split into the 5 commandments that are kind of directed to honoring God, and then the last 5 commandments that basically say that here's how you're going to then be right with everybody else. So not only does this make us right with God, but it helps us to have healthy people, healthy families, a healthy society. The society where you don't lie, where you don't cheat, where you don't steal, where you don't murder, those sorts of things. It kind of helps people get along better when you don't do any of those things, coveting one another and being jealous. So let's just finish quickly with impact. So what happens as a result of the Jews, these Hebrew people, the descendants of Abraham, coming into this special covenant relationship with God and beginning to learn his laws? Um, One is they begin to rise to the moral standard exemplified by God. In other words, that's the other thing. When God says, Jews, my people, I want you to do these things, he's not just like being a hypocrite, or he's not just holding up, yeah, go do that great thing and be a great person and love people. He's saying, be more like me. Be more like me. And that ultimately, the standards of this covenant is not, to follow all these, rules, but become more like me. Follow me. We're supposed to fall in love with the law. The Jews were supposed to love the law, the covenant, because again, the whole purpose of a covenant was to bring about a relationship, not to just add a bunch of restrictions and rules for control's sake, but to say, you know what, the more you do these things, the more you're going to be like me. And that, of course, is ultimately going to be exemplified when Jesus shows up, God in the flesh. And now we don't say, follow all the laws of the Old Testament. We say, be more like Jesus, because the standard of this covenant is not an idea, it's a person. It's a relationship. It's not a religion, it's a relationship. And it's a relationship built on love, faithfulness, and luckily for me, I don't know about you, but luckily mercy. And that's it. Anyway, God wants a relationship. He wants you to follow the rules, but ultimately so that you guys we can know him and draw closer to him. And so not only did it draw them closer, the impact of the covenant not only drew the people into relationship with God, but it set them apart from the other cultures, made them different than the other Near Eastern cultures. The nations that would eventually be destroyed by, largely by during the conquest of Jericho and the Promised Land, they were places that the Philistines, they practiced child sacrifice. Ingrained into their religion was prostitution by both men and women. It was rife with vengeance killings, not an eye for an eye, but okay, you took my eye, I'm going to take your head, kind of a thing. And that if somebody commits a crime, or even has an accidental crime, we're going to seek revenge on them. It was full of idolatry, them worshiping, again, the personified natural world, sacrificing their children, sacrificing animals not to a god, but to spirits that they imagined being all over the physical world. They were set apart by becoming very educated and very literate. Even today, the Jews are set apart by their devotion to education and to literacy, because now they have this law, this covenant that requires them to read and to think and to reason their way. And that placed a huge emphasis on education. And then also monogamy. Although it takes the Israelites a little while to fully separate from this, you have David and Solomon and other people with multiple wives, the standard is set very early on in the covenant that no, marriage is between a man and a woman, one of each, and together they will form the foundation of the society as a nuclear family. And again, that set them apart from all the other cultures, which is one reason why it took so long for it to change, because they were so much in the mindset of the Near East. They were so much in the mindset of what the other cultures were doing. I'd say you could even add to this list slavery. It's going to take a while for slavery to end, and you even see God regulating it, but it's very clear from the conditions of the covenant that ultimately slavery is not part of God's plan. And so more and more as they enter in this covenant, they look less and less like the world around them, which is just a powerful lesson for all of us. It also gives birth to equal justice, a principle of equal justice. We saw in Code of Hammurabi how justice was dependent on your social class and who was part of the crime. However, the Hebrew covenant has a concern with equal treatment for all individuals. And you see incredible rights given towards women, rights given even towards children, protections for the poor. We have a picture here that's Ruth gleaning in the field. That's one of the Levitical laws. They were told you should leave some extra crops when you're harvesting, or if you drop something, you shouldn't pick it up, but leave it on the ground or leave the edges of your field unharvested so that the poor would have a chance to take money, and or to take food or resources. And that's what Ruth was doing in the book of Ruth. She was basically picking up these scraps left over by law so that she as a poor person would have something to eat. There's protections against minorities. There's protections for immigrants. And so there was our concern that today for equal justice for all groups, that's birthed right here in the Hebraic law, Hebraic covenant. And so just to kind of sum it up, the impact is this idea that what the covenant does is it creates a view of man as valuable, dignified, equal, and also of mercy and compassion. And that while we have these high standards, God's going to extend mercy. Even when his people mess up, he's not going to give up on them. He's going to redeem them. He's going to show them love. He's going to bring help. He's going to give them a way to become right with him. And we'll talk about that in the worship lecture coming up next. But it's a totally radical view of the human and God relationship that does not exist in the ancient Near East. And that's kind of the big idea, is the separation, where here's the way that the world was thinking, and all of a sudden these Jews show up and their relationship with God causes them to kind of head off in a different historical direction than the other nations. So the big idea is, remember what a covenant is: personal relationship with God. It's a commitment that brings about relationship. It's a rule by God and not by man. Within that, God promises, because it's a covenant, he will never give up on us. He is keeping his promise. Even though I'm a sinner and I've totally fallen short of his covenant, he made it so I still get to have a relationship with him because of Jesus. He's never given up. Law, the fact that you give somebody a law, you are giving them moral choice and responsibility. You are saying you can choose right versus wrong, and the law is going to help you make the right decisions. Sometimes we think, oh, rules are so lame. No, rules are actually a gift, because they help us do the thing that in our hearts we want to do the right thing. We want to be better. We want to improve, and law helps us to do that. And as it says there, law signals that, again, you have value. You are capable. When a teacher holds you to high standards, you might think, oh, I wish they'd just make this assignment easier. No, they're saying, they're giving you dignity, and they're giving you a path to prosperity. They're saying, you know what, you can do better. What you are capable of, you need to rise to that. And it feels stressful and maybe harsh, and you don't like the discipline that goes with that, but it's telling you that you are more than what you think you are. And then lastly, just the covenant matters because, as I said, it begins to take Israel separate from the surrounding nations, Egypt, Sumeria, and the Philistines, and begins to show mankind that there's a different way to view the world, there's a different way to live, and that there's a different way to view their God. And that's going to be the birth. And we're talking, this is the birth of Western civilization, as Israel enters this covenant and breaks. And these new ideas are going to change the world to the point now where we think, oh, well, that's just how everybody thinks. No, no, no. It started here with the Jewish covenant with their God. Alrighty. Hope that helped. Reach out if it didn't seem to answer some of your questions on the slides, and we will see you soon.